Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my Finding My Way podcast. This is podcast number 60, titled Preface. Podcasts 34 through 61 are stories from the year of Army training I experienced. The training started in August 1966 and ended in June 1967. The stories are published in the book Reluctant Lieutenant from Basic to OCS in the 60s, which was published by Texas A&M University Press as a military history. Podcast 60, Preface, is an account of the situation that caused Jerry to be forced into the Army, why he wrote The Reluctant Lieutenant, his attempts to write it as factual as possible, and his appreciation to those who assisted him. It is recommended that you listen to the Army training stories in the order in which the podcast number presents them, so that you can appreciate the full contextual richness of this account. Podcast 60, Preface. This book is an account of my reluctant entrance into the U.S. Army in late August of 1966, and of the 10 months and 26 days of training it provided me before I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry. The reader and I re-experienced basic combat training, BCT, advanced infantry training, AIT, and Infantry Officer Candidate School, OCS. During the spring of 1966, the Vietnam War was a constant evening news items. There was talk of sending in more troops, and there were shots of anti-war protesters pressed in between television commercials. I paid attention to the situation because I was concerned that I might be involved in it. My main focus, however, was on my graduate studies. I hoped that it would not affect me directly, as I was married, in graduate school, planning to get a master's degree at the end of August, and then to do a year-long internship as a school psychologist in one of the school systems around Cincinnati, Ohio. After the internship, I would work for a school system. All of those activities were draft exempt. I thus was surprised when I received an induction center notice in June saying that I had been reclassified 1A. It meant that I could be drafted at any time. I immediately called my Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania draft board. They put me at the end of their monthly draft list until September, which meant that on September 1 I would be the first one on the list and would be drafted into the Army. It was too late for me to get into an officer candidate class in the Navy or Coast Guard. I was going to be in the Army. After talking with the recruiting sergeant and taking the Army's OCS examination, I learned I could go to any Army OCS class I wanted to after basic training and AIT. I explained to the recruiter that I would like to work in the Army, in which I could use my training as a master's level school psychologist. He said that I wanted to be in the Adjutant General Corps. Unfortunately, there were no OCS programs for that branch. I would have to request a branch transfer after I got commissioned. He explained, and the Army's infantry branch had the highest rate of branch transfers from it. With that in mind, I signed up for infantry and went back to school intent on finishing my master's program. A few days after I completed the last exam for my MA, I was in the Army. I grew up in a career Coast Guard family. My father was a chief boatswain's mate and then a warrant officer. We had moved frequently as he was transferred from lifeboat stations on the Great Lakes to the navigation waterways of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The military was not a bad life in my way of thinking. Being in combat, on the other hand, was not something I wanted to do. I wanted to work on making things better for school children. Being in the Army would interrupt all of that. In basic training, I learned that a lot of the men had just graduated from college or graduate school, as I had. They had all suddenly lost their draft-exempt status and had signed up for OCS. Throughout basic training, AIT, and infantry OCS, the people in charge commented on what a highly educated group we were. The infantry OCS graduation book the Army gave us states that the men in my OCS company had an average of 15.7 years of education. However, the vast majority of us were commissioned as second lieutenants in the Army with about the same amount of Army experience, 10 months, 26 days. I wrote this book for several reasons. First, many of the stories I relate are funny. I enjoy sharing them and have told them more times than I can count to relatives, friends, and acquaintances. Another reason for writing the book was to share with younger people what was really happening to me and hundreds of thousands of other men at that time. Too often I have encountered young adults who try to interpret that time in an overly romanticized or demonized way. I realize they do not know how it really was. I wanted them to understand how it actually was, at least for me. With that goal in mind, I have tried to avoid interpreting the things that happened to me other than the way I interpreted them at the time. I have also described the events as I remembered them in the order in which they occurred. As I progressed through the Army's training program, some of the earlier events made more sense to me. Again, I did my best not to reinterpret what had happened to me earlier. I want the reader to experience Army training in the same manner that I did. My third reason for writing this book is the fact that in the areas of education, business, and human service systems, I see too many of the same faulty training assumptions and approaches to the institutional change process today that I experienced in the Army in 1966. I hope that in reading this book, the change agents in these organizations will see some of the practices that their organizations need to improve upon. As I mentioned, I have tried to be as accurate as possible in telling my story. I am aware of the tricks that memory can play when one tries to recall events from the past. The belief systems that people possess cause them to interpret events in a specific manner. Thus, people with different beliefs interpret the same events in a completely different way. Those of us who have brothers or sisters often experience this phenomenon at family gatherings. My psychology training before, during, and after my time in the Army has made me keenly aware of the problems inherent in eyewitness accounts, especially in stories told from memory that relate to emotionally traumatic events. While acknowledging the difficulty of achieving completely factual accuracy in writing this book, I believe it is a true account of the events in which I participated. I can say with greater certainty that this book provides an accurate picture of my emotional response to the training I experienced. While it is probably true that there are some factual errors in my narrative, I am not aware of them. Where such errors may occur, they do not detract from the core truth of the book. I have been diligent in carefully recording everything exactly as I remembered it. The reader will note that there are places where I am vague on the exact number of days that were spent doing some things, such as living in tents in the field. I simply do not remember those details, so I omit them. Again, details like that are not important to conveying to the reader the cultural significance of events or the emotional impact they had on me. There are several facts that give me assurance that I have accurately related the overall experience described in the book. In support of these facts are the positive responses I have received from Vietnam-era veterans who have read my narrative. I also rediscovered my infantry OCS graduation book, and it confirmed what I wrote. I found the original order sending me from OCS to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which verified my account of those events. I obtained confirmation about the cold weather I remember at Fort Dix. Dale Patrick Kaiser of the Carbon Dioxide Information Analysis Center in the Environmental Science Division at Oak Ridge National Laboratory was able to review the temperature records for October and November 1966. On several days, the temperature in the region was below freezing. The coldest was October 31st, when it got down to 21 degrees Fahrenheit. It was reassuring to discover that my memory was fairly accurate in recalling such things as the manual of arms and the military technology of the time. Dale Wilson, a retired Army major and the copy editor of this book, graciously corrected the errors I did make. I have been meticulously careful to report exactly what I have remembered with one exception. I use pseudonyms for all of the people mentioned in the book except myself. In many cases, I can remember only a person's nickname. For many others, I have no memory of any name. I did, of course, have some close friends whose full names I still remember. However, I felt it best to be consistent and use pseudonyms for everyone. As a literary device for conveying the immediacy of the moment we all felt during training, I frequently use dialogue. The vast majority of the dialogue is not literally what was said, but it does convey the meaning and its emotional color. In a few cases, the quotations are exactly as I remembered them. Throughout the book, I mention rumors I heard. Rumors were always going around, and we were always acting on them. Some were later proven to be accurate, but most of them were not. When I report that the rumor mill said such and such, I am not saying that a rumor was true. I do not know if it was true. I had no way of verifying what was a rumor and what was fact. We had to determine if we believed something and then act accordingly. The consequences of such actions took care of themselves. In the main, the Army never tried to address the rumors one way or the other that I could tell. I thus have related rumors as I experienced them and the impact that they had on me and the other trainees when we heard them. It is my desire that you find this book interesting and gain insight into the thinking of the young men caught up in the beginning of the military buildup in Vietnam. I hope you will better understand what these young people experienced during their initial contact with the Army culture of 1966, and will reflect on how both people and institutions under stress deal with change. This book is dedicated to Anna, my wife, an enthusiastic resident editor who supported me throughout my U.S. Army experiences and the other events of our 58 years together. It is also dedicated to the men and women who went through the training that I describe. This is our collective story. There is another important group of people to whom I wish to dedicate this book. All of those who supported me in writing it. Foremost is Charlotte Duncan. It was Charlotte, a professional editor, who convinced me that the book needed to be written and would be well received. Charlotte edited all of the work before I sent it to the publisher. Her desire to read each chapter before it was written was a constant motivation. Scott Danforth is another person whose continued optimism inspired me to complete this book. Kurt Peeler's support of my efforts was also a significant encouragement. Jim Sakovich's early recognition of the book's merits and support through the publishing process were greatly appreciated. There are many more names I do not list here to whom I wish to express my deep gratitude for their support of this project. From the perspective of being an educational administrator and school psychologist during the 44 years since I was a student in the Infantry Officer Candidate School, I find there is one individual from the military experience who has my sincerest admiration for his dedication to making positive changes in the OCS training program. I wish to offer a belated thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Nick J. Nickus, my battalion commander at the Infantry Officer Candidate School in 1967.